When did you realize your seemingly perfect neighbor was actually running the neighborhood like a prison warden? It started with the grass. Mrs. Henderson moved in next door when I was 12, and within a week, she'd transformed her yard into something that belonged in a luxury home magazine. Perfect hedges trimmed with mathematical precision, pristine flower beds arranged by height and color coordination, lawn so uniformly green it looked like artificial turf imported from a golf course. My mom was genuinely impressed. Finally, someone who takes pride in their home, she said, watching Mrs. Henderson deadhead roses at exactly 7 a.m. every morning like clockwork, dressed in a pristine gardening outfit that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. Mrs. Henderson was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed even for yard work, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd moved here from some upscale suburb after her husband died, claiming she wanted a quieter community where she could contribute to neighborhood excellence. The first rule appeared on our door 3 days later, a laminated note in perfect cursive handwriting. Dear neighbors, trash cans must be returned to garage within 2 hours of pickup to maintain our beautiful neighborhood standards. Thank you for your cooperation in preserving property values. Sincerely, Margaret Henderson, concerned neighbor. My dad laughed when he read it. Bit much, but whatever keeps the peace. At least she cares about the neighborhood looking nice. More notes followed within the week, each one more specific and controlling than the last. No bikes on front lawns after 5 p.m., no children playing outside after 6 p.m. on weekdays, 7 p.m. on weekends, no music audible from sidewalks at any time of day, no decorations except tasteful seasonal displays approved by neighborhood consensus, no parking on the street for more than 24 hours without prior notification, no pets unleashed in front yards, even on owner's property. Each note was signed with that same flowing signature and delivered in person with a warm smile and concerned expression that felt increasingly rehearsed. When the Johnsons across the street painted their shutters navy blue instead of the approved beige palette that apparently existed only in Mrs. Henderson's mind, she knocked on every door with a professional-looking clipboard and petitioned to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetic standards. I'm sure you understand, she told each neighbor with that saccharine smile. One poorly chosen color can affect everyone's home values. We have to think collectively about our community image. She always smiled when she delivered these messages, always spoke in that sweet, concerned voice that dripped with false community spirit, always had perfectly logical reasons wrapped in neighborhood concern and property value protection, but there was something in her eyes, a cold calculation that made me uncomfortable. But I started noticing things that made my skin crawl and my instincts scream danger. How she'd appear at her front window whenever kids were playing outside, watching us through expensive binoculars like we were specimens in some twisted social experiment. How she'd accidentally be gardening in her front yard whenever someone came home past 9 p.m., noting the exact time in a little leather notebook with the dedication of a surveillance officer. How she'd strike up seemingly innocent conversations with new residents, asking pointed questions about their work schedules, family situations, financial status, and personal habits. She knew everything about everyone. What time we left for school, when our parents came home from work, which families had marital problems, who was struggling financially, which teenagers were dating, what cars belonged to, which houses, who had medical appointments, who worked night shifts. She'd memorized our entire neighborhood like a comprehensive security dossier. I started keeping my own notes about her behavior. She walked her small white dog, a perfectly groomed Maltese named Princess, at the same times every day, 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 9 p.m. But these weren't normal dog walks. She'd stop at each house, studying the property, taking photos with her phone, occasionally measuring distances with a small tape measure she kept in her pocket. The breaking point came when my best friend Jake's family got evicted after living here for 8 years. The Kowalski family had been our neighbors since before I was born. Jake's dad, Tom, was a union construction worker who'd helped build half the houses in our development. His mom, Sarah, worked part-time at the elementary school cafeteria and made the best chocolate chip cookies in the neighborhood. They were the kind of people who'd shovel your driveway without being asked, and always had an extra Halloween costume if a kid showed up trick-or-treating unprepared. They'd been struggling since Tom lost his construction job during the recession 6 months earlier. Work was scarce, medical bills were piling up from Sarah's diabetes medication, and they were 3 months behind on their mortgage, despite Tom taking whatever day labor he could find. Mrs. Henderson knew all of this. She'd seen the late-night visits from relatives bringing groceries, the yard sale signs desperately trying to raise money, the stress written all over Sarah's face every time she checked the mailbox for more bills. Instead of offering help like any decent human being with an ounce of compassion, Mrs. Henderson systematically destroyed them with bureaucratic warfare that was both methodical and cruel. She called code enforcement about their unkempt property when Tom couldn't afford professional lawn service and was working 16-hour days trying to keep his family afloat. She reported them to the HOA for every minor violation she could manufacture: garden hose left out overnight, trash can visible from the street for 3 hours instead of 2, children's chalk art on their own driveway, a loose board on their fence that Tom hadn't had time to fix while working 3 part-time jobs. Each violation came with fines ranging from $50 to $200. Each fine added to their financial burden. Each complaint created a paper trail that made them look like problem tenants when they desperately tried to negotiate with their mortgage company for more time. But Mrs. Henderson's cruelest move was reporting them for child neglect. because Jake and his little sister Emma sometimes played outside unsupervised while their parents were working. Child Protective Services actually showed up, terrifying the children and humiliating the family. The case was dismissed immediately. The kids were happy, healthy, and well cared for, but the investigation remained on their record. Jake's mom cried as they loaded the moving truck, her hands shaking as she tried to explain to her 8-year-old daughter why they had to leave their home and move in with Grandma 3 states away. "I don't understand," she told my mother through tears, standing in our driveway surrounded by boxes of their life. "We've been good neighbors. We never bothered anyone. We helped people. Why would someone do this to us?" My mom hugged her and whispered something about fresh starts and how things would get better, but I could see the anger in her eyes as she glanced toward Mrs. Henderson's house. That night, I watched from my bedroom window as Mrs. Henderson stood in her perfectly manicured yard at midnight, installing another security camera. This one pointed directly at Jake's now empty house, like she was claiming territory or marking her victory. She spent 20 minutes adjusting the angle, making sure it captured the entire front yard and driveway. She was smiling in the darkness, and something about that smile made my blood run cold. Then I saw her pull out a thick manila folder, the same kind I'd glimpsed in her office, labeled with Jake's address. She made a final note, wrote something across the front of the folder, then walked back inside with a satisfied expression of someone who'd just completed a successful project. That's when I decided to fight back. I started documenting everything with the dedication of an investigative journalist building a case. Her midnight walks around the block with a high-powered flashlight, photographing license plates and noting which houses had lights on past her arbitrary bedtime. Her daily conversations with code enforcement. She was on a first-name basis with every inspector in the city and knew exactly which violations would result in fines. The way she'd time her dog walks to coincide with people leaving for work, watching who forgot to lock their doors or left garage doors open. I bought a cheap digital camera and started taking photos of her surveillance activities. I documented her measuring distances from sidewalk to house, taking pictures of children's toys, photographing cars parked on the street for what she deemed too long. Most disturbing was her home office setup, which I studied carefully through her kitchen window while returning packages that had been misdelivered to our address, something that happened suspiciously often. Filing cabinets lined one entire wall, rows and rows of manila folders, each one labeled with a street address. Our address was there, thick with papers. Every house on our block had a folder. Some were thin, probably newer residents who hadn't yet attracted her attention. Others bulged with documentation that suggested years of surveillance and complaint building. She had a computer set up with multiple monitors, a high-end printer, and what looked like photo editing software. Maps of our neighborhood covered one wall, with colored pins marking different houses. I couldn't tell what the color coding meant, but our house had a yellow pin, the Patels had red, and Jake's old house had been marked with black. What could she possibly need to file about us? I asked my mom, describing what I'd seen in detail. Probably just HOA stuff, Mom said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Maybe she's just very organized about community issues. But I knew it was more than organization. This was surveillance. This was stalking. This was someone building comprehensive cases against every family in our neighborhood, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mrs. Henderson's control escalated dramatically when the Patel family moved into Jake's old house 2 months later. They were young professionals. He was a software engineer, she was a nurse, with twin toddlers who loved playing outside, riding tricycles on the sidewalk, and drawing elaborate chalk masterpieces on their own driveway. Raj and Priya Patel had moved here from an apartment complex, excited to finally have a yard where their children could play safely. The twins, Arun and Anya, were 3 years old and full of the kind of innocent energy that makes neighborhoods feel alive. Within 48 hours, Mrs. Henderson was at their door with her neighborhood guidelines printed on official-looking letterhead that made her rules seem like actual laws. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with that fake smile. I wanted to share some community standards that help maintain our property values. Children's outdoor play should be limited to designated hours, no earlier than 9 a.m., no later than 6 p.m. on weekdays, 7 p.m. on weekends. Toys must be stored immediately after use. Chalk drawings should be removed within 24 hours. We've found this helps preserve the peaceful atmosphere that makes our neighborhood so desirable. Mr. Patel tried to reason with her, his voice patient but strained. They're just kids. They're not hurting anyone. They're playing on our own property. Property values are everyone's concern, she replied smoothly. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining neighborhood standards. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community. Mrs. Patel looked confused and hurt. In our old neighborhood, people loved seeing children play outside. It made the community feel alive and safe. Mrs. Henderson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This isn't your old neighborhood. We have higher standards here. When the Patels didn't immediately comply with her arbitrary rules, because they were reasonable people who believed children should be allowed to play in their own yard, Mrs. Henderson's systematic campaign began with military precision. Code enforcement visited 3 times in 2 weeks, citing violations for everything from a garden hose left out overnight to children's toys being visible from the street. The HOA sent official violation notices for chalk drawings on their own driveway, a tricycle parked on their front porch, and music from their children's outdoor playtime that registered barely above normal conversation level. Each violation came with a $75 fine and a warning that accumulating violations could result in legal action. I watched Mrs. Patel cry as she scrubbed hopscotch squares off her own concrete driveway at 6 a.m., her twins watching in confusion from the window, asking why Mommy was erasing their artwork. "Mommy, why is the mean lady angry at our pictures?" Little Anya asked loud enough for me to hear from my yard. Mrs. Patel didn't have an answer. That's when I started reaching out to families who'd moved away, determined to uncover the full scope of Mrs. Henderson's neighborhood reign of terror. What I discovered over the next month of phone calls and online research made my stomach turn. The Garcia family had lived here for 5 years before leaving last summer. Their teenage son Miguel was a straight A student who'd been repeatedly reported for loitering in his own front yard while waiting for friends to pick him up for school, sports practice, or part-time work. Mrs. Henderson had called the police 6 times, claiming a suspicious individual was casing houses for potential break-ins. When officers realized it was just a kid waiting for rides, they stopped responding to her calls about him. But the harassment continued with noise complaints every time he played music in his room, violations for his basketball hoop being incorrectly positioned, and reports to the school claiming he was dealing drugs because teenagers occasionally gathered in their driveway to hang out. "She made our son feel like a criminal for existing in his own home," Mrs. Garcia told me over the phone, her voice still shaking with remembered frustration. Miguel started asking us to drive him places instead of having friends pick him up because he was so tired of being watched and reported. A 17-year-old shouldn't have to feel like that. The breaking point for the Garcias came when Mrs. Henderson called Child Protective Services, claiming Miguel was being inadequately supervised because he came home from his part-time job at 10 p.m. when his parents were asleep. CPS investigated and found nothing wrong, but the humiliation and stress drove the family to sell their home and move across town. "We just wanted peace," Mrs. Garcia said, "but she made our lives hell. Every single day was a new complaint, a new violation, a new way to make us feel unwelcome. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore." The elderly Kowalski couple, no relation to Jake's family, had been harassed about their bird feeders until they sold their home of 30 years. Mrs. Henderson claimed the feeders attracted vermin and filed complaints about noise from the birds singing at dawn. She documented property damage from bird droppings with photographs and measurements, convinced code enforcement that the feeders were a health hazard, and even called animal control claiming the birds were aggressive toward pedestrians. When the Kowalskis tried to compromise by moving the feeders to their backyard, she complained that the birds were flying over her property and leaving droppings on her car. "That woman is a sociopath," Mrs. Kowalski told me bluntly when I called her at her new apartment. "She smiles to your face and stabs you in the back with paperwork. We lived there 30 years without a single complaint from anyone. Then she moved in and suddenly we were criminals for feeding birds that had been coming to our yard for decades." The Chen family had moved away after Mrs. Henderson targeted their teenage daughter Lucy for having friends over to study. She'd filed noise complaints about parties that were actually homework sessions, reported the family for excessive vehicle traffic when study group members parked on the street, and eventually convinced other neighbors that the Chens were running some kind of unlicensed tutoring business from their home. The pattern was always the same. Mrs. Henderson would identify something she didn't like: children playing, teens gathering, elderly people with non-standard landscaping, families with unconventional schedules, anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of appropriate, then systematically use official channels to eliminate it. Code enforcement, HOA violations, noise complaints, police reports, even calling child services on families whose only crime was not living up to her impossible standards. She'd weaponized bureaucracy, turning every municipal service into her personal enforcement army. But the most chilling discovery came when I found her online presence. Mrs. Henderson was active on several forums dedicated to neighborhood improvement and property value protection. Under the username Community Watch 47, she'd written detailed guides about using municipal services to eliminate problem residents. Her posts read like instruction manuals for suburban warfare. Document everything: photos, times, dates, frequency. Municipal employees respond better to organized complaints with evidence. Know your local codes. Most people violate something every day. You just need to know what to look for. Target the weakest link first. Families under financial stress are most likely to give up and move rather than fight back. Always frame complaints in terms of property values and community safety. Never make it personal. She'd been coaching other suburban vigilantes on tactics for harassment through official channels, spreading her methods like a virus to other neighborhoods across the country. Armed with testimonies from 8 different families and screenshots of her online activity, I went to my parents with a folder full of evidence. Dad was skeptical until I showed him the violation notices Mrs. Henderson had filed against us. 17 in 2 years, all dismissed but carefully documented in what appeared to be preparation for a larger campaign. Mom went pale when I told her about the filing cabinet, the online forums, and the systematic pattern of harassment I'd uncovered. She's been building cases against everyone, I explained, spreading photos and documentation across our dining room table, collecting evidence for complaints, waiting for the right moment to strike. She's not just controlling, she's predatory. And we're probably next on her list. Dad studied the timeline I'd created, showing how families were targeted in sequence. This is deliberate, systematic. She's been running a campaign to remake this entire neighborhood according to her vision. She's driven away 8 families in 2 years, I said. All the complaints follow the same pattern. She identifies what she considers undesirable, and then files violation after violation until people give up and leave. And every time a family moves, property values actually drop because of the negative attention and reputation for being a difficult neighborhood. Mom looked at the photos of Mrs. Henderson's midnight surveillance walks. We need to do something. This woman is destroying our community. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson knocked on our door at exactly 8 a.m. She was holding a thick manila folder. Our folder, I realized with a chill, and her smile was sharper than usual. "Good morning," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I need to discuss some concerns that have come to my attention regarding your family's compliance with neighborhood standards." She pushed past my parents into our living room without invitation, spreading photos across our coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence at trial. Our garage door left open overnight when Dad was working late in his shop. My bike left on the front walkway when I'd rushed inside to use the bathroom. Our Christmas lights up until January 3rd instead of being taken down immediately after New Year's Day. A small oil stain on our driveway from Dad's motorcycle. "These violations are accumulating," she said sweetly, her voice carrying an undertone of threat. "According to neighborhood standards and municipal codes, we're approaching a threshold that could require intervention from appropriate authorities." She pulled out a thick binder and flipped through pages of documentation. Photos, dates, times, measurements. "I've been very patient, but patterns of noncompliance need to be addressed before they affect property values for all of us." My dad's jaw tightened, and I could see his hands clenching into fists. "Are you threatening us?" "Of course not," she laughed, but there was ice in her eyes. "I'm simply protecting our community standards and property values. Surely you want what's best for the neighborhood. Surely you don't want to become problematic neighbors like the others who couldn't adapt to our standards." The words hung in the air like a curse. After she left, Mom immediately deadbolted the door and closed all the curtains. "This has to stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This woman is insane. She's going to destroy us just like she destroyed the others." I'd been thinking the same thing. That night, I climbed onto our roof through my bedroom window and positioned myself where I could see into Mrs. Henderson's yard and observe her nighttime activities. What I witnessed over the next several hours changed everything. At exactly 2 a.m., she emerged from her house with a high-powered flashlight and that leather notebook, dressed in dark clothing like some suburban ninja conducting covert operations. For 2 hours, I watched her systematic surveillance routine. She walked from house to house, photographing anything she could use as evidence. A newspaper left on a porch past her arbitrary deadline. A garbage can lid sitting slightly askew. A garden hose not perfectly coiled according to her standards. A child's toy forgotten in a front yard. Cars parked on the street that she deemed too old or inappropriate for the neighborhood's image. She stopped at each house, taking photos from multiple angles, measuring distances with a tape measure she produced from her pocket, making detailed notes about times and violations. At the Patel's house, she spent 40 minutes documenting everything: the tricycle left on their porch, chalk residue she'd missed during their forced cleaning, the children's sandbox in the backyard, which she photographed through gaps in the fence. She even measured the height of their fence to see if it violated any municipal codes. But the most disturbing part was watching her enter other people's property. She walked onto lawns to get better photos. She peered into windows. She opened garbage cans to photograph contents. She was trespassing on every property in the neighborhood as part of her surveillance operation. I took pictures of everything, using my phone's night mode and the zoom lens attachment I'd bought with my allowance money. The next day, I printed my photos and embarked on a door-to-door campaign, visiting every house on our block and the 2 adjacent streets. I knocked on doors and showed neighbors what Mrs. Henderson was doing in the dead of night. "She's been spying on all of us," I told the horrified neighbors. "Taking pictures, building files, documenting everything we do. She's treating our neighborhood like her personal surveillance state." Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down stared at the photos with growing alarm. I thought I was imagining things. I kept feeling like someone was watching me. She always seems to know when my teenager comes home late, when I forget to bring in my trash cans, when I have friends over. Now I know why. "Because she's watching," I said. "All of us, all the time. She knows our schedules, our habits, our weaknesses, and she's using that information to build cases against us." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who'd been living in fear and confusion finally understood what was happening. The isolated incidents they'd dismissed as coincidence suddenly formed a clear pattern of systematic harassment. By evening, we had organized a full neighborhood meeting at the community center. 37 families attended, the largest neighborhood gathering in anyone's memory. People shared their Mrs. Henderson stories for the first time, and the pattern became crystal clear. She'd systematically identified and eliminated anyone who didn't fit her vision of the perfect neighborhood, then moved on to her next targets in an endless cycle of suburban ethnic cleansing. "She made us feel crazy," Mrs. Johnson said, holding her husband's hand, "like we were the ones being unreasonable for wanting to live normal lives in our own homes." Mr. Patel held up a stack of violation notices 6 inches thick. 41 complaints in 3 months. "Our children are afraid to play outside in their own yard. My daughter asked me yesterday if we're bad people because the mean lady is always angry at us." Mrs. Williams, an elderly woman who'd been afraid to speak up before, finally found her voice. "She reported my grandson for loitering when he came to help me with groceries. A 12-year-old boy helping his grandmother is somehow suspicious behavior, according to her." Young families shared stories of children asking why they couldn't play outside like kids in other neighborhoods. Teenagers talked about feeling like criminals for walking to their own front doors. Elderly residents described being afraid to tend their gardens because any deviation from perfection would result in complaints. That's when old Mr. Morrison spoke up. He'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and usually kept to himself, the kind of quiet neighbor who minded his own business and expected the same courtesy from others. "I know what she's doing," he said quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "My late wife worked in social services for 30 years. She specialized in cases of systematic abuse and control. This is textbook predatory behavior, but instead of targeting individuals in isolation, she's targeting an entire community." He paused, looking around the room at all the faces that had been worn down by months or years of harassment. "She identifies vulnerabilities in families, financial stress, unconventional schedules, children with high energy, elderly people with declining physical ability to maintain perfect properties, then exploits those vulnerabilities through official channels. She's not just controlling, she's dangerous. And she won't stop until she's driven out everyone who doesn't meet her impossible standards." We decided to fight back collectively, forming what we called the Neighborhood Defense Network. Every family would document any interaction with Mrs. Henderson. We'd support each other through any bogus complaints, showing up as witnesses and character references. We'd attend every HOA meeting as a united front. We'd share information about her tactics and warn new residents about her methods. Most importantly, we'd stop being afraid and isolated. Mrs. Henderson noticed the change immediately, and her response was swift and vindictive. When she tried to give the Patels another violation notice about their garden gnome being inappropriate yard ornamentation that lowers property values, Mr. Johnson appeared with his phone recording the entire interaction. "This harassment needs to stop," he told her calmly. "These people have done nothing wrong." Mrs. Henderson's fake smile faltered. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us," Mrs. Chen said, arriving with her own phone camera. "We're documenting everything now." When she called code enforcement about Mrs. Chen's wind chimes, 5 neighbors showed up as witnesses that they were well within legal noise limits and actually quite pleasant to listen to. When she tried to photograph the Martinez family's quinceañera decorations as excessive and culturally inappropriate, she found herself surrounded by neighbors who'd formed a protective barrier around the celebration. Her fake smile began slipping more frequently, revealing glimpses of the cold rage underneath. The confrontation came 2 weeks later. Henderson called an emergency HOA meeting, claiming there was a coordinated campaign to undermine neighborhood standards and property values, led by juvenile delinquents and their enablers. She stood at the front of the community center like a general addressing her troops, pointing at families like a prosecutor naming co-conspirators in some vast conspiracy against suburban perfection. "These people are destroying our property values with their chaos," she declared, her voice rising with each word and losing its carefully controlled tone. "Children running wild at all hours, unauthorized decorations cluttering front yards, noise violations, unkempt properties, inappropriate cultural displays. They're turning our beautiful neighborhood into a slum, and property values are already declining because of their behavior." She gestured toward me specifically. "Led by this disrespectful teenager who's been conducting surveillance and harassment campaigns against law-abiding neighbors who simply want to maintain community standards." That's when I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, pulling out my folder thick with documentation. "Would you like to explain these?" I'd been very busy over the past 3 months. My investigation had revealed the full scope of her operation, and the numbers were staggering and damning. She'd filed over 400 complaints in 2 years against various neighbors. She'd cost the city thousands of dollars in frivolous inspections and administrative processing. She'd driven away 8 families, causing 6 houses to sell significantly below market value, which actually hurt everyone's property value, the opposite of her stated goal. Most damning, I'd found her extensive online activity, forums where she bragged about cleaning up neighborhoods and maintaining appropriate demographics, detailed guides she'd written about using municipal bureaucracy to eliminate undesirable elements, screenshots of her advising other suburban vigilantes on tactics for harassment through official channels. She'd even posted before and after photos of our neighborhood, bragging about how much quieter and more orderly it had become after her intervention. "She's been systematically harassing families to force them out of the neighborhood," I announced to the packed room. "This isn't about property values or community standards. This is about one person's need to control everyone around her and reshape an entire community according to her personal prejudices." Mrs. Henderson's carefully constructed mask finally fell completely away. "Those people lowered the tone of the neighborhood," she snarled, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried perfectly in the silent room. "Children screaming at all hours, trashy decorations, property neglect, noise, chaos, inappropriate cultural displays. Someone had to maintain standards. Someone had to preserve what makes this neighborhood worth living in, by spying on families, by filing false complaints, by terrorizing children." Mr. Patel shot back, standing up with his wife beside him. She turned on him with pure venom in her eyes. "Your brats are destroying this neighborhood with their constant noise and mess. If you can't control them properly, you shouldn't be here. This isn't some third world country where children run wild." The racist undertone was unmistakable, and the room erupted. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up for years finally found their voices. Mrs. Henderson stood there, outnumbered and exposed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as everyone she'd victimized finally fought back. "You're the problem!" Mrs. Martinez shouted. You've made everyone miserable. Our neighborhood was fine before you moved here," added Mr. Morrison. "You brought the chaos by dividing us against each other." The HOA voted unanimously to strip her of any authority and launch a formal investigation into her complaint history. The city announced they'd be reviewing all her violation reports for patterns of harassment and considering charges for filing false reports. 3 families she'd driven away were considering legal action for damages and emotional distress, but Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished with her reign of terror. The next morning, I woke to police officers at our door. Mrs. Henderson had filed a restraining order against me, claiming I'd been stalking and harassing her for months. She had photos of me on my roof, taken completely out of context, and sworn statements about my threatening behavior and campaign of intimidation against an elderly woman. She'd weaponized the legal system one last time, turning my investigation into evidence of stalking and harassment. At the court hearing, she played the victim with Academy Award-worthy performance. A frightened elderly woman being terrorized by an unstable teenager with a vendetta against anyone who tried to maintain community standards. She had documentation going back months, carefully crafted to support her narrative of being an innocent neighbor trying to protect property values while being persecuted by a vindictive family. She'd even brought character witnesses, people from her online forums who testified via video call about her dedication to neighborhood improvement and her history of being unfairly targeted by troublemakers. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd included photos from her midnight surveillance walks as evidence of my stalking behavior. Photos that could only have been taken by someone hiding in bushes at 2 a.m., watching houses with telephoto lenses from concealed positions on other people's property. Mrs. Henderson, the judge said, studying the timestamps and angles on the photographs with growing suspicion. "How exactly did you obtain these photos of this young man on his roof at this particular angle and distance?" Her confident expression faltered for the first time in the proceedings. I was taking evening walks for my health and noticed suspicious activity at 2 a.m. with professional camera equipment from positions that would require you to be trespassing on other people's property. The prosecutor I'd contacted through our lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence that Mrs. Henderson has been conducting systematic surveillance of her entire neighborhood. The photos I'd taken of her midnight activities were entered into evidence, along with testimonies from neighbors about her trespassing and harassment. The case against me was dismissed, and Mrs. Henderson found herself facing charges for stalking, trespassing, and filing false police reports. 6 months later, she moved away. No farewell parties, no goodbye notes, no forwarding address. Just a moving truck one morning and an empty house with a for sale sign that stayed up for less than a week. But her departure didn't immediately heal the damage she'd caused. It took months for neighbors to feel comfortable outside again. Children who'd been trained to fear playing in their own yards needed time to rediscover the joy of outdoor play. Families who'd been isolated by her divide and conquer tactics had to rebuild relationships with neighbors they'd been suspicious of. The Garcia family moved back into their old house 3 months later, and Miguel immediately set up his basketball hoop in exactly the same spot it had been before. He plays until sunset now, and neighbors actually stopped to shoot baskets with him. The Patels twins have transformed their front lawn into an elaborate chalk art gallery that changes daily. Other children in the neighborhood have joined them, creating a collaborative masterpiece that covers sidewalks and driveways throughout the block. Mrs. Chen's wind chimes play gentle melodies in the evening breeze, and neighbors actually stop to listen and smile instead of hurrying past in fear of being reported. We started having regular neighborhood barbecues, holiday parties, and informal gatherings. Children play together across yards without regard for property lines. Teenagers hang out in driveways without looking over their shoulders. Elderly residents sit on their porches in the evening, waving to passersby. Our neighborhood isn't perfect now. It's better. It's alive again. We learned that community standards should bring people together, not drive them apart. The Kowalski couple moved back 6 months later, and their bird feeders are more popular than ever. Families bring their children to watch the birds and learn about different species. We established a real neighborhood watch program, focused on helping and protecting each other rather than surveillance and control. We created a community garden where Mrs. Henderson's house used to have her pristine but sterile lawn. Last week, I got a message on social media from a teenager in another city. His neighbor was demanding everyone follow strict community standards and filing complaints about every minor violation, using the exact same tactics Mrs. Henderson had perfected. I sent him my complete research file and a detailed guide I'd written about organizing neighborhood resistance. My message was simple: document everything. You're not crazy, you're not alone, and bullies count on you thinking you are. Because if there's one thing I learned from our ordeal, it's that predators like Mrs. Henderson thrive on isolation. They want you to think you're the only one being targeted, that resistance is futile, that it's easier to just comply than fight back. They count on shame, fear, and division to maintain control. Sometimes the perfect neighbor is just a perfect predator in disguise, using the language of community improvement to mask a campaign of systematic oppression. And sometimes, one determined teenager with a camera and enough courage can remind an entire neighborhood that they don't have to live in fear. Mrs. Henderson thought she was running a prison, with herself as the warden and all of us as inmates, following her arbitrary rules and living in constant fear of violation. She forgot that prisoners can organize, communicate, and fight back. And when they do, the warden loses every time. Now our neighborhood is what she claimed to want, a place where property values are stable, children are safe, and neighbors look out for each other. But we achieved it through community and cooperation, not control and fear. The real irony is that Mrs. Henderson's own behavior was the biggest threat to our property values and community safety. Getting rid of her was the best thing that ever happened to our neighborhood.